What I'm about to share with you are some of the most disturbing true stories about neighbors that you'll ever hear. These aren't made-up tales or exaggerated rumors. These are real events that happened to real people who discovered that the person living next door was hiding something absolutely terrifying. Before we start, I need to warn you that these stories contain graphic descriptions of violence, murder, and psychological terror. If you're not comfortable with that kind of content, you should probably stop watching now. For everyone else, make sure your doors are locked, and let's dive into these nightmare neighbor stories. Our first story takes us to Wichita, Kansas, and involves a man who became known as the BTK Killer. Dennis Rader lived in a normal suburban neighborhood, in a normal house, with his wife and 2 children. He was a compliance officer, enforcing city regulations. He was president of his church council. He was a Cub Scout leader. He coached his daughter's softball team, by every external measure. Dennis Rader was exactly the kind of neighbor you'd want living on your street. He mowed his lawn, kept his house maintained, waved hello to neighbors, attended community events. He was involved, engaged, and seemed to genuinely care about his neighborhood and community. But Dennis Rader had a secret. Between 1974 and 1991, he systematically tortured and murdered 10 people. His nickname, BTTK, stood for bind, torture, kill, which was his method. He would break into homes, tie up his victims, torture them, and then murder them. He took souvenirs from his victims and kept detailed records of his crimes. And through all of this, his neighbors had absolutely no idea. They lived next to him, talked to him regularly. Their children played with his children, and nobody suspected a thing. One of Rader's neighbors, a woman named Sharon, lived directly across the street from the Rader family for over 15 years. She and her husband would chat with Dennis regularly. Their kids went to the same schools. They attended the same church. Sharon later said in interviews that Dennis seemed completely normal, if a bit strict and particular about neighborhood rules. He was the kind of guy who would measure your grass to make sure it wasn't too long, who would report code violations, who wanted everything orderly and proper. It was annoying sometimes, but not scary. Just a guy who took rules very seriously. Sharon remembered one summer afternoon in 1985 when Dennis came over to her house to complain that her teenage son's car was parked too far from the curb. It was a minor thing, and Sharon's husband told Dennis to lighten up. They had a brief argument, nothing major, and Dennis left. What Sharon didn't know was that just 3 months earlier, Dennis had broken into a house about 2 miles away and murdered an entire family. He strangled the mother and 3 children, one by one. And then he went home, had dinner with his own family, tucked his own children into bed, and went to sleep. The next day, he was out measuring grass heights and enforcing parking regulations like nothing had happened. Another neighbor, a man named Kevin, worked with Dennis on the church council. They would meet every month to discuss church finances, events, fundraising. Kevin said Dennis was detail-oriented to the point of being obsessive. He wanted every dollar accounted for, every decision documented, every rule followed precisely. Kevin found it a bit much sometimes, but he respected Dennis's dedication to the church. They weren't close friends, but they were friendly. Kevin's wife even went to lunch a few times with Dennis's wife Paula, swapping recipes and talking about their kids. The really disturbing part about Dennis Rader was how thoroughly he compartmentalized his life. During the day, he would enforce city codes, measuring the height of people's grass, and writing citations for parking violations. He would attend church services and lead youth programs. He would come home and help his kids with homework. And then at night, or on weekends, he would stalk potential victims. He would drive around neighborhoods looking for targets. He would break into homes when families were out and hide, waiting for them to return. He would study his victims, learn their routines, plan every detail of their murders. and then he would execute those plans with brutal efficiency. One of his victims was a woman named Nancy Fox. Dennis broke into her apartment in December 1977. He waited for her to come home from work. When she walked in, he was hiding in her closet. He came out, tied her up, and strangled her. Before leaving, he called 911 from a payphone and reported the murder himself, disguising his voice. He wanted credit for his work. He wanted people to know what he'd done. This was part of his psychological game. Over the years, he sent multiple letters to police and media, taunting them, describing his crimes, giving himself the BTK nickname. He loved the attention, loved feeling smarter than the investigators who couldn't catch him. And through all of this, his neighbors saw nothing unusual. Sharon across the street would wave to Dennis as he left for work. Kevin would sit next to him in church, would pray with him, would plan charity events together. Dennis's children went to school with neighbor kids, had play dates, celebrated birthdays together. Dennis's wife Paula was involved in the PTA, hosted book club meetings at their house. The Rader family looked perfect from the outside, a model American family living in Middle America. In 2005, Dennis Rader was finally arrested after evading capture for decades. The break in the case came when Dennis sent a floppy disk to a TV station, thinking police wouldn't be able to trace it. But they could, and the metadata led them right to him. When police arrested Dennis at his workplace, his co-workers were shocked. When they searched his home, his family was in complete disbelief. Paula Rader immediately filed for divorce. She said she had no idea, and investigators believe her. Dennis had hidden his crimes so thoroughly that even his own wife, sleeping next to him every night for decades, never suspected he was a serial killer. The neighborhood where Dennis lived was in complete chaos after his arrest. News vans lined the street for weeks. Reporters interviewed everyone who would talk. Sharon, the neighbor across the street, said she threw up when she heard the news. She had let her children play in the same yard where BTK's children played. She had invited a serial killer into her home for neighborhood association meetings. She had stood in her driveway talking to him about property values and school board elections while he had trophies from his victims hidden in his house just yards away. The violation she felt, the betrayal, the horror of realizing what had been living across the street from her family for 15 years, it was overwhelming. She moved away within 6 months. She said she couldn't sleep in that house anymore, couldn't look out her window at the Rader property without feeling sick. Kevin from the church struggled with different guilt. He had sat in church with Dennis, had prayed alongside him, had worked with him to plan charity events and youth programs. And the whole time, Dennis was living this double life. Kevin said in an interview that what haunted him most was remembering conversations they'd had about morality, about right and wrong, about protecting children and serving God. Dennis had participated in these conversations, had even led some of them, all while knowing he had murdered children. The hypocrisy, the complete disconnect between Dennis's public persona and his private actions, it shattered Kevin's ability to trust people. He said he became paranoid, questioning everyone's motives, unable to take anyone at face value anymore. The impact on Dennis Rader's own children was perhaps the most tragic. His daughter talked publicly years later about the experience of learning her father was BTK. She said her entire childhood was a lie. Every memory she had of her dad, coaching her softball team, helping her with homework, taking family vacations, all of it was tainted by the knowledge that he was a murderer. She said she struggles with her identity, with who she is, knowing that half her DNA comes from a serial killer. She changed her name, moved far away from Kansas, and tries to live a quiet life away from the notoriety. But she says she can never escape it completely. People who know her story look at her differently, wondering if evil is hereditary, if she might have some of her father's darkness inside her. Dennis Rader was convicted of 10 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. he'll die in prison. During his trial and in subsequent interviews, Dennis showed a disturbing lack of remorse. He talked about his crimes in a detached, clinical manner, as if he was describing someone else's actions. He referred to his murderous impulses as Factor X, something outside his control that compelled him to kill. But investigators and psychologists who studied him said this was nonsense. Dennis was fully in control. He planned his crimes meticulously. He stopped killing for years at a time when he felt the risk was too high. He wasn't driven by uncontrollable urges. He killed because he enjoyed it, because it made him feel powerful, and because he thought he was smart enough to never get caught. The Rader house was eventually sold, but it took years to find a buyer. Nobody wanted to live where BTK had lived. The neighborhood's reputation was destroyed. Property values plummeted. Many families moved away, unable to shake the feeling that evil had lived among them for so long without anyone noticing. The church where Dennis had been president of the council had to change its name and rebrand because the association with BTK was too strong. The Cub Scout troop he'd led was disbanded. Everything Dennis had touched was contaminated by his crimes. Now, if you're enjoying these stories, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out and lets me know you want more content like this. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Now, let's move on to our second story, which involves neighbors who were also a married couple hiding horrific secrets. This story takes us to Gloucester, England, and involves a couple named Fred and Rosemary West. From the 1970s through the early 1990s, Fred and Rose lived in a house at 25 Cromwell Street with their children. To their neighbors, the Wests seemed like a working-class couple, a bit rough around the edges, but nothing unusual for that neighborhood. Fred worked in construction. Rose was a homemaker who also worked as a prostitute, something neighbors whispered about, but nobody really interfered with. The house was always busy, with people coming and going, children playing in the yard, typical chaos of a large family. What the neighbors didn't know was that Fred and Rose were serial killers. Between 1973 and 1987, they murdered at least 12 young women and girls, possibly more. Some victims were their own children. Others were lodgers who rented rooms in their house. Others were young women Fred picked up hitchhiking, or Rose lured in through her prostitution work. The victims were tortured, sexually abused, and murdered. Their bodies were dismembered and buried in the basement, under the patio, and in various locations around the property. For over 15 years, Fred and Rose lived normal lives on the surface, while committing horrific crimes in their home. One of the West's neighbors, a woman named Margaret, who lived 3 doors down, knew the family casually. She said Fred was always friendly, would chat about home improvement projects, would offer to help if she needed handyman work done. Margaret declined, finding Fred a bit creepy in a way she couldn't articulate, but she said he never did anything overtly threatening. Rose was more distant, would nod hello but rarely engaged in conversation. Margaret's teenage daughter was friends with one of the West daughters and would sometimes go over to their house to hang out. Margaret now thinks about those visits with horror, knowing what was buried beneath that house while her daughter played there. Another neighbor, an elderly man named Harold, lived directly next door to the Wests. He shared a wall with them for over a decade. Harold said he would sometimes hear strange noises through the wall at night. Scraping, digging, what sounded like heavy objects being moved. He assumed Fred was doing construction work at odd hours, renovating the basement or something. Harold would bang on the wall sometimes when the noise got too loud late at night. He never investigated further, never called authorities. What Harold was actually hearing was Fred digging graves and burying bodies. The sounds that annoyed him were the sounds of murder victims being disposed of just feet away. The West House was a horror show behind closed doors. Fred had converted the basement into a torture chamber. There were restraints on the walls, soundproofing materials, tools used for dismemberment. He and Rose would bring victims down there and subject them to prolonged torture before killing them. Some victims were held for days before being murdered. The children who lived in the house, Fred and Rose's own children, were aware that something terrible was happening. Some of them were abused by Fred and Rose as well, but they were too terrified to tell anyone. Fred ruled the house with violence and intimidation. Everyone was afraid of him. One of the victims was the West's own daughter, Heather. When Heather was 16, she threatened to tell authorities about the abuse she'd suffered. Fred and Rose murdered her and buried her under the patio. They told neighbors and Heather's siblings that Heather had run away from home, that she'd gone to find work in another city. Nobody questioned this story. Heather had been a troubled teenager, and it wasn't unusual for kids in that neighborhood to leave home young. What nobody knew was that Heather was buried in her own backyard, just feet from where her siblings continued to live. Another victim was a young woman named Shirley Robinson. Shirley had been a lodger at the West House and had been having an affair with Fred. She got pregnant with Fred's child. Rose was jealous and angry. Together, Fred and Rose murdered Shirley and buried her in the garden. Shirley was 8 months pregnant when she was killed. Her baby died with her. Neighbors had known Shirley, had seen her around the house, had chatted with her in passing. When she disappeared, Fred and Rose said she'd moved back to her family. It was a plausible explanation. Nobody investigated. The truth about the Wests came out in 1994 when police investigating an unrelated matter obtained a warrant to search the property looking for the remains of Heather West. Fred had joked to someone that Heather was under the patio, and the person had eventually reported this comment to police. When police started digging in the basement and yard, they found body after body. The excavation took days. Each time they thought they'd found all the victims, they'd discover another set of remains. The neighborhood was swarmed by media. Neighbors were evacuated. The house became a crime scene that investigators would work for weeks. Margaret, whose daughter had visited the house, was traumatized. She said her daughter had played in that house, had eaten meals there, had slept over once. The thought that there were bodies buried beneath where her daughter had walked, where she had laughed and joked with friends, it was sickening. Margaret said her daughter required extensive therapy and still struggles with trust issues. How do you recover from learning you unknowingly played above the graves of murder victims? How do you sleep at night, knowing you were feet away from corpses and didn't sense anything wrong? Harold, the neighbor who shared a wall, said he felt like an accomplice somehow. He'd heard the sounds of Fred burying bodies, and he'd done nothing except bang on the wall to complain about noise. Harold said if he had called police, if he had been more suspicious instead of just annoyed, maybe some of those victims could have been saved. The rational part of him knew he had no way of knowing what those sounds really were, but the guilt remained. Harold moved away shortly after the truth came out. He couldn't live in that house anymore, couldn't sleep next to the wall he'd shared with a serial killer's home. He said every sound he'd heard for over a decade was now recontextualized as the sound of murder and disposal. The investigation into the Wests revealed even more horror. Police found evidence that Fred and Rose had also murdered victims years earlier, before they moved to 25 Cromwell Street. They found remains at previous addresses where the Wests had lived. The total body count was at least 12 confirmed victims, but investigators believe there may be more bodies that were never found. Fred had worked in construction for decades and had access to numerous building sites where he could have disposed of bodies. He had the skills and knowledge to bury bodies in ways that would make them nearly impossible to find. Fred West hanged himself in prison in 1995 before his trial could begin. He left no confession, no explanation, nothing. He took whatever knowledge he had about additional victims to his grave. Rosemary West was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. She maintains her innocence to this day, claiming Fred forced her participation and that she was a victim too. She says Fred controlled her through violence and psychological abuse. Nobody believes her. The evidence showed Rose was an active and willing participant in the murders. She had lured victims, had participated in the torture, had helped dispose of bodies. She was as guilty as Fred. The house at 25 Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996. The demolition was filmed and documented to ensure that no piece of the house remained intact. The debris was crushed and buried in an undisclosed location to prevent any pieces from becoming morbid souvenirs. True crime enthusiasts had already begun showing up, trying to take bricks or pieces of the house as keepsakes. The lot where the house stood remains empty to this day. The city owns it, and as stated, it will never be developed. It's essentially a memorial to the victims, though there's no marker or plaque. Just an empty lot where one of Britain's most notorious houses of horror once stood. The street sign for Cromwell Street was removed because people kept stealing it as a souvenir. The remaining houses on the street saw their property values collapse. People who owned homes there couldn't sell them. Who wants to live on the street where Fred and Rose West committed their crimes? The neighborhood has tried to move on, but the West case remains one of the most infamous in British criminal history. Documentaries are made about it regularly. Books are written. Tours still come through the area, with guides pointing out where the house used to stand. The surviving children of Fred and Rose West have struggled with their legacy. They were victims of their parents' abuse, witnesses to horrors no child should see, and now they carry the burden of being the children of serial killers. Some have spoken publicly about their experiences, trying to reclaim their narratives and separate themselves from their parents' evil. Others have disappeared from public view entirely, changing their names and trying to build lives away from the notoriety. But it follows them. Someone always figures out who they are, and then the whispers start again. The neighbors who lived on Cromwell Street during the West's killing spree. Those who interacted with Fred and Rose regularly. They carry their own trauma. The knowledge that they smiled and waved to murderers, that they made small talk with people who were torturing and killing young women. It's something that can never be forgotten or fully processed. Margaret still has nightmares about her daughter playing in that house. Harold still thinks about the sounds he heard through the wall. The guilt, even though it's irrational, even though they had no way of knowing, it remains. Thank you for watching. If you're finding these stories gripping, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. There are more stories coming. The BTK case and the Fred and Rose West case share some disturbing similarities despite happening in different countries. Both involved people who successfully maintained dual lives for decades. Dennis Rader was the helpful neighbor, the church leader, the scoutmaster. Fred and Rose West were the working-class couple raising a large family. On the surface, they were integrated into their communities. People knew them, interacted with them regularly, and saw nothing alarming. This is what makes these cases so terrifying for those who lived near them. There were no obvious red flags, no clear warning signs that something was horribly wrong. In Dennis Rader's case, his need for control and order actually made him seem like a model citizen. He enforced rules, maintained high standards, kept everything organized. These traits made him seem responsible and civic-minded. Nobody realized these same traits were what made him such an effective serial killer. He planned every detail of his murders with the same precision he brought to his compliance officer job. He documented everything, kept meticulous records, left nothing to chance. His organizational skills, which his neighbors admired, were the same skills he used to evade capture for 3 decades. With Fred and Rose West, Their criminality was somewhat more visible, but it was explained away by class prejudices. Rose worked as a prostitute, which neighbors gossiped about but ultimately dismissed as her business. Fred was rough around the edges, not educated, a bit crude. People didn't expect refined manners from someone of his background. The house was often chaotic, with lodgers coming and going, children running around unsupervised. But in a working-class neighborhood where many families struggled, this didn't seem out of place. It just seemed like a family barely keeping it together, which was common enough that nobody looked closer. The sounds that Harold heard through the shared wall are particularly haunting. He heard Fred digging, heard heavy objects being moved, heard scraping and thumping. These sounds woke him up at night, annoyed him, made him bang on the wall in frustration. But he never once thought those sounds could be anything sinister. Why would he? People do home repairs. People rearrange their basements. People work at odd hours. The most obvious explanation seemed reasonable, so Harold accepted it. This is how our brains work. We default to the most likely, most innocent explanation for things we observe. It takes something truly unusual, truly alarming, to make us consider darker possibilities. And even when neighbors did notice things that seemed off, they weren't sure what to do with that information. Margaret felt uneasy about Fred, thought he was creepy, so she declined his offers to help with repairs. That was her acting on her instincts. But she didn't take it further. She didn't report him to anyone. She didn't warn other neighbors. Because what would she report? A feeling, a vibe. That's not enough for police to act on, and it's not enough to justify warning others. So Margaret kept her unease to herself, and her daughter continued to visit the West House, continued to play in a building where bodies were buried in the cellar. Sharon, who lived across from Dennis Rader, also had moments of doubt. She found Dennis too strict, too focused on rules and regulations. He seemed overly invested in controlling his environment and the people around him. But again, this wasn't criminal behavior. Lots of people are controlling. Lots of people are obsessive about order. It's annoying, but it's not dangerous. So Sharon tolerated Dennis, kept her distance when she could, and never imagined he was capable of murder. How could she? Dennis seemed so normal in every other way. He went to work, came home to his family, coached Little League, led church meetings. That's not the behavior of a monster. Except it was, and that's the truly disturbing part. The children who grew up on these streets, who played with Dennis Rader's children, who visited the West House, they're adults now, many of them with children of their own, and they carry the weight of having been close to such evil without knowing it. These aren't just abstract stories to them. They remember specific moments, playing catch in Dennis Rader's yard, eating dinner at the West House, walking past 25 Cromwell Street on the way to school. These were normal childhood memories that have now been tainted by the knowledge of what was really happening. It changes how they see their own childhoods, how they understand their own histories. One particularly disturbing detail from the Dennis Rader case involves his daughter's volleyball games. Dennis attended every single one of her games, cheering in the stands like any proud father. Other parents would sit with him, would chat during breaks, would compliment him on being such a supportive dad. They had no idea that the man sitting next to them, clapping for teenage girls in volleyball uniforms, had murdered multiple women and girls. They had no idea he was storing photographs of his victims at home, that he kept trophies from their bodies, that he regularly revisited these items to relive his crimes. He was doing all of this while simultaneously being a present, involved father. The compartmentalization is almost impossible to comprehend. Similarly, Fred West worked on construction sites during the day, doing manual labor alongside other workers. They would have lunch together, would joke around, would talk about their families and their lives. Fred's coworkers knew he had a large family, knew his wife was difficult, knew he struggled financially. They saw him as one of them, a working-class guy trying to make ends meet. They had no idea that Fred was using his construction skills to hide bodies, that he was using tools from work sites to dismember victims, that he was using his knowledge of building and excavation to create the perfect burial sites. His ordinary day job was providing him with the skills and resources for extraordinary evil. The psychological impact on these communities has been studied by researchers trying to understand how people process this kind of betrayal. When someone in your community turns out to be a serial killer, it shakes your fundamental understanding of reality. You thought you knew what evil looked like. You thought you'd recognize danger if it was close to you. You thought your instincts would warn you if something was wrong. And then you learn you were wrong about all of it. Evil looked like your neighbor. Danger was living right next door. Your instincts completely failed you. This realization can be devastating and can create lasting psychological trauma. Many of the neighbors from these cases reported developing anxiety, paranoia, and trust issues after the truth came out. They second-guess their judgment constantly. They see potential danger in everyone. They overreact to minor oddities in their new neighbor's behavior. They struggle to feel safe in their own homes and neighborhoods. Some developed full PTSD with nightmares, flashbacks, and panic attacks. The knowledge that they lived near such horror, that they interacted regularly with killers, that they smiled and waved to people who were committing atrocities. It broke something in them that therapy can help, but can never fully fix. The property values in these neighborhoods are another lasting impact. The Rader house in Kansas sold for well below market value, and it took years to find a buyer. Each subsequent sale has also been at a discount. People don't want to live where BTK lived, even though logically they know the house itself isn't evil. It's just a structure. But the association is too strong. The same is true for the lot where the West House stood. It remains empty, not just because the city owns it, but because nobody wants to build there. Who would buy a house on that lot? Who would raise children there? The land itself has been contaminated by the crimes committed there, at least in the psychological sense. The churches and organizations these killers were involved with also suffered lasting damage. Dennis Rader's church lost members after his arrest. People didn't want to worship in a place where BTK had led services. The Cub Scout troop disbanded. The youth programs Rader had been involved in were all shut down or restructured. The organizations themselves weren't responsible for his crimes, but the association was enough to taint them. Parents pulled their children out. Volunteers quit. The institutions that Rader had used as cover for his normal life crumbled in the wake of his exposure. For the children of these killers, the burden is almost unbearable. They did nothing wrong, but they carry the stigma of their parents' crimes. Dennis Rader's daughter has spoken about the difficulty of dating, of making friends, of building a professional life, when people know who her father is. She says some people are morbidly curious, asking inappropriate questions about her childhood. Others are judgmental, looking at her like she might be dangerous too. Still others try to be sympathetic but end up being patronizing. She can't escape her father's legacy. It follows her everywhere. The West children faced similar struggles. Those who survived their parents' abuse and testified against Rose West had to live with the knowledge that they helped convict their mother. This was the right thing to do, the necessary thing, but it's still complicated emotionally. She was their abuser, but she was also their mother. Some of the West children have written books or given interviews, trying to reclaim their narratives. Others have completely withdrawn from public life, changed their names, and attempted to disappear. But in the age of the internet, it's almost impossible to completely escape your past. Someone always finds out, and then the whispers begin again. The detectives and investigators who worked these cases also carry trauma. They had to excavate bodies from the West property, had to catalog evidence of torture, had to interview traumatized children, had to piece together years of horrific crimes. Many of them struggled with what they saw. Some retired early. Some developed drinking problems. Some needed therapy. The BTK task force worked for decades trying to catch Dennis Rader. And when they finally did, there was relief, but also anger at how long he'd evaded justice. The lead investigator on the West case had nightmares for years about the basement at 25 Cromwell Street, about the torture chamber they found, about imagining what the victims went through in that space. These cases also changed police procedures. After Dennis Rader, law enforcement became more aware of how serial killers can hide in plain sight, how they can maintain normal lives while committing extraordinary crimes. Training programs now include information about the BTK case as an example of how not to overlook someone just because they seem normal. The West case led to changes in how police handle missing persons reports, particularly for vulnerable young women. The fact that so many of Fred and Rose's victims went missing without serious investigation was a systematic failure that led to policy changes. But perhaps the most lasting impact of these cases is on how neighbors view each other. In the neighborhoods where these crimes occurred, people are more suspicious now, more watchful, less trusting. That sense of community that existed before, where people knew each other and looked out for each other, has been replaced by wariness and fear. People keep to themselves more. They don't invite neighbors in as freely. They watch for signs of anything unusual, anything that might indicate danger. This hypervigilance is exhausting and ultimately corrosive to the social fabric that makes neighborhoods functional. The question that everyone asks, that neighbors from these cases torment themselves with, is, could this have been prevented? Could someone have stopped Dennis Rader before he killed 10 people? Could someone have saved the victims of Fred and Rose West? And the honest answer is maybe, but probably not. These killers were too skilled at hiding their true natures, too careful about maintaining their facades. The signs that existed were too subtle, too easy to explain away. Even in hindsight, even knowing what we know now, it's hard to point to a specific moment where a neighbor could have intervened and changed the outcome. Our third story takes us to Cleveland, Ohio, and involves a man named Anthony Sowell. In the late 2000s, Anthony lived in a house in a predominantly black, working-class neighborhood. He was a registered sex offender who had served 15 years for attempted rape. His neighbors knew about his conviction, as he was required to register, but Anthony seemed to be living quietly. He kept to himself mostly, didn't cause visible trouble. In a neighborhood where people valued privacy and minded their own business, Anthony blended in, just another resident trying to get by. But between 2007 and 2009, Anthony was murdering women. His victims were predominantly black women, many of them struggling with addiction and homelessness. They were women who society often overlooked, women who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. Anthony knew this. He counted on it. He would lure them to his house with promises of drugs or money. Once inside, he would attack them, rape them, murder them, and hide their bodies in his home. By the time police finally searched Anthony's property in 2009, there were 11 decomposing bodies throughout the house. Some were in the basement, some were in the crawl space. Some were buried in the yard. The house was a charnel house, and Anthony had been living there, surrounded by corpses for months or years, while his neighbors went about their lives next door. One of Anthony's neighbors, a woman named Janice, who lived directly next door, had noticed terrible smells coming from his property for years. She complained to the city multiple times, thinking there was a dead animal or a sewage problem. The smell was so bad sometimes that she couldn't open her windows. She had to keep her house sealed up, especially in summer, because the odor was overwhelming. She would see Anthony coming and going, would nod hello if they made eye contact, but they didn't interact much. She found him odd and unfriendly, but not threatening. Just a guy who kept to himself. The city's response to Janice's complaints is particularly infuriating. They sent inspectors out a few times, but the inspectors attributed the smell to a nearby sausage factory. There was a meat processing plant in the area, and city officials decided that must be the source of the odor. They didn't thoroughly investigate Anthony's property. They didn't knock on his door and demand to search. They took the easy explanation and moved on. If they had investigated properly, if they had insisted on entering Anthony's house and basement, they would have found the bodies. They would have saved lives. But they didn't. Another neighbor, a man named Ray, who lived across the street, said he saw Anthony bringing women to his house fairly regularly. The women always looked rough, clearly struggling with drug addiction or homelessness. Ray assumed Anthony was using drugs too, maybe selling them. Ray minded his own business, figured what Anthony did in his house was his own affair. In that neighborhood, in that economic reality, you didn't pry into other people's business. You could get hurt sticking your nose where it didn't belong. So Ray saw women go into Anthony's house and never thought twice when he didn't see them leave. He assumed they left when he wasn't looking, or maybe through a back entrance. It never occurred to Ray that they weren't leaving at all. The truth about Anthony came out in October 2009, when a woman named Latundra Billups escaped from his house after he attacked her. She fought him off and ran out of the house screaming. Police investigated and obtained a warrant to search the property. What they found was beyond horrific. Bodies in various states of decomposition. Some were recent, killed within the past few months. Others had been there for over a year. The smell was so overwhelming that officers had to wear masks. Many of them became physically ill. Evidence of torture and prolonged captivity was everywhere. Anthony had been operating this house of horrors while neighbors complained about the smell and the city did nothing. The bodies were scattered throughout the property in disturbing ways. 2 were in the living room, concealed in garbage bags. 4 were in the basement. 2 were buried in the backyard, in shallow graves that were easily discoverable if anyone had bothered to look. 1 was in the crawl space. 2 were in upstairs bedrooms. Anthony hadn't even tried very hard to hide them. He'd just stashed them in various locations around the house and continued living there. The level of decomposition made identification difficult. Dental records and DNA had to be used to figure out who the victims were. As police began identifying the victims, a disturbing pattern emerged. These women had all been reported missing. Their families had filed reports. But because the victims were Black women, struggling with addiction, and often involved in survival sex work, their cases weren't prioritized. Police had essentially written them off as runaways, or as people who'd chosen to disappear. This systemic failure allowed Anthony to continue killing without serious scrutiny. The women were vulnerable, and both Anthony and the system knew it. Janice, who lived next door and had complained about the smell for years, was interviewed extensively by media after the discovery. She said she felt vindicated that the smell had been something serious, not just a factory or a dead animal like the city kept telling her. But she also felt guilty for not pushing harder, for not demanding more thorough investigation. She said if officials had listened to her complaints and actually investigated Anthony's house properly, maybe some of those women would still be alive. The city had failed these victims, but Janice felt she had too, even though rationally she knew she'd done what she could. Janice moved out of that house within weeks of the discovery. She couldn't stay there anymore. She couldn't sleep knowing 11 women had decomposed next door while she complained about the smell. She said every time she'd opened her window and smelled that odor, she'd been smelling death. She'd been smelling human decomposition. And she'd just closed her window and tried to ignore it. The knowledge of what that smell really was, the knowledge that those were real women rotting just feet away, it destroyed her. Ray, who'd seen women entering Anthony's house, struggled with immense guilt. He'd watched women go into a serial killer's house and done nothing. He said he should have been more suspicious, should have questioned why he never saw the women leave, should have called police. But Ray also pointed out the reality of the situation. These were women in the drug trade, going into the house of a man who was likely in the drug trade. In that neighborhood, you minded your own business, or you became a target yourself. Calling police could get you labeled a snitch, which could be dangerous. Ray said the guilt of survival, of inaction, was crushing, but he also understood the context of poverty and violence that made intervention dangerous. Anthony Sowell was convicted of 11 murders, 11 counts of abuse of a corpse, and numerous other charges, including rape and kidnapping. He was sentenced to death and is currently on death row, awaiting execution. Throughout his trial, Anthony showed little remorse. He claimed some of the deaths were accidental, that the women died from rough sex or drug overdoses, and that he panicked and hid the bodies rather than calling police. But the evidence showed deliberate murder. The women had been strangled, beaten, bound. This wasn't accidental. This was predation. Anthony's house was demolished in 2011. The demolition was necessary not just symbolically, but practically. The house was so contaminated with biological material, so permeated with the smell of death, that it couldn't be salvaged. The lot was cleared completely. The soil was treated. Community members planted a memorial garden on the site to honor the victims. Their names are engraved on a memorial stone. The garden is maintained by volunteers who want to ensure these women aren't forgotten, that their lives meant something beyond how they died. The neighborhood struggled in the aftermath. Property values, which were already low, dropped further. Residents felt betrayed by authorities who had ignored complaints about the smell for years. A class action lawsuit was filed against the city by the victims' families, alleging that police and city officials' failure to investigate properly allowed the murders to continue. The lawsuit was settled out of court, with the city agreeing to implement new policies for investigating missing persons cases, particularly for vulnerable populations. The case became a symbol of how society devalues certain lives. The victims were Black women struggling with addiction. They were poor. They were often homeless or living in unstable situations. When they disappeared, the response was minimal. Compare this to how missing white women from middle-class families are treated. There's immediate media attention, massive search efforts, public outcry. The disparity is stark and disturbing. Anthony Sowell's victims didn't get that level of concern or resources. They vanished, and the world barely noticed until their bodies were found. The families of the victims have spoken publicly about their pain and frustration. They knew their daughters and sisters were missing. They reported it. They pushed for investigations, but they were largely ignored. Police told them their loved ones had probably just moved on, that they'd turn up eventually. The families felt their concerns weren't taken seriously because of who their loved ones were, because of the neighborhoods they came from, because of the struggles they faced. This dismissal allowed Anthony to kill again and again. One victim's mother said in an interview that she knew something was wrong when her daughter disappeared. Her daughter called her regularly, and suddenly the call stopped. The mother went to police, filed a report, but nothing happened. No detective followed up. No search was conducted. The mother tried to investigate herself, asking around the neighborhood, putting up flyers. She was told by police to stop interfering, that they would handle it, but they didn't handle it. And her daughter's body decomposed in Anthony Sowell's house for over a year before being discovered. The emotional toll on the families is immeasurable. They had to wait years for justice. They had to endure a trial where Anthony's defense team tried to paint the victims as responsible for their own deaths, suggesting they were willing participants in dangerous activities. The families had to sit in a courtroom and hear their loved ones dehumanized and blamed. And even after Anthony was convicted and sentenced to death, the appeals process means he's still alive over a decade later. still getting 3 meals a day, still breathing while their daughters and sisters are gone. The neighbors who lived on that street during Anthony's killing spree have their own trauma to process. Many of them moved away, unable to stay on a street with such terrible associations. Those who stayed report constant anxiety, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting anyone. They check on their neighbors more frequently now. They pay attention to strange smells or suspicious activity. They call police even for minor concerns. The innocence, the ability just live your life without constantly being on guard, that's gone. It was taken by Anthony Sowell and can never fully return. Before we move to our next story, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment and let me know what you're thinking about these cases. Now let's continue with our 4th story. This case takes us to Sacramento, California, and involves a woman named Dorothea Puente. Now, Dorothea wasn't exactly a neighbor in the traditional sense. She ran a boarding house, which meant she had many people living under her roof, in her care. But the people who lived on her street, the actual neighbors who saw her every day, they thought she was a sweet elderly woman who was doing a good deed by housing people who were down on their luck. Dorothea was in her late 50s and early 60s during the time of her crimes. She was short, grandmotherly, always dressed nicely. She baked for her neighbors, maintained a beautiful garden, and seemed like the kind of older woman you'd want living on your block. But Dorothea Puente was killing her tenants. Between 1982 and 1988, she murdered at least 9 people who lived in her boarding house. Her victims were elderly, disabled, or struggling with addiction. They were vulnerable people who had nowhere else to go, and Dorothea took advantage of that. She would ply them with drugs and alcohol to keep them sedated and compliant. Then, when the opportunity arose, she would kill them, usually with drug overdoses. She would bury the bodies in her yard or dispose of them in other ways. Then she would continue to collect their social security and disability checks, forging their signatures. It was murder for profit, plain and simple. Dorothea's neighbors had no idea what was happening. They would see tenants come and go from the boarding house, but they assumed people were just moving on, finding other places to live, getting back on their feet. Dorothea would tell neighbors that so-and-so had moved back home to be with family or had gotten a job in another city. The explanations seemed plausible. Nobody thought to question this sweet old lady who was just trying to help people. One neighbor, a woman named Janet, lived right next door to Dorothea's boarding house. She and Dorothea were friendly. Dorothea would bring Janet baked goods, would chat with her over the fence about gardening. Dorothea's garden was beautiful, always full of flowers and plants, always well-maintained. Janet admired Dorothea's green thumb, admired her dedication to making her property look nice. Janet said Dorothea seemed lonely, that she talked a lot about wanting companionship, about the tenants being like family to her. Janet felt sorry for Dorothea, thought she had a good heart for helping these downtrodden people who had nowhere else to go. Another neighbor, an older man named Harold, would sometimes help Dorothea with heavy lifting or minor repairs around her property. He said she was always very grateful, very sweet. She would insist on making him lunch as thanks, would fuss over him like a grandmother. Harold never went into the boarding house itself, just did work on the exterior. He said Dorothea's garden was always immaculate. What Harold didn't know was that he was walking over the graves of several of Dorothea's victims. The garden was beautiful because it was fertilized with human remains. The flowers grew so well because they were feeding on the bodies of murdered people. The truth about Dorothea came to light in 1988 when a social worker reported one of Dorothea's tenants, a man named Alberto Montoya, missing. Alberto was mentally disabled, and the social worker had been checking on him regularly as part of her caseload. When she went to the boarding house to visit Alberto, Dorothea said he had gone to Mexico. The social worker didn't believe this. Alberto had no means to travel and no reason to go to Mexico. He didn't have family there. He barely functioned independently. The story made no sense. The social worker reported her concerns to the police and insisted they investigate. When police came to Dorothea's house to ask about Alberto, she was cooperative and charming. She invited them in, offered them tea, explained that Alberto had been talking about Mexico and must have found a way to get there. The officers were initially inclined to believe her. She seemed like a nice old lady, but the social worker kept pushing, kept insisting something was wrong. Eventually, police obtained a warrant to search the property. As police began digging in Dorothea's backyard garden, they made a horrific discovery. Bodies, multiple bodies in various states of decomposition. As they continued excavating, they found more. 7 bodies in total were found buried in Dorothea's yard. 2 more victims were found elsewhere, linked to Dorothea through investigation. 9 murders in total, possibly more that were never confirmed or found. The scene during the excavation was surreal. Police had cordoned off the property, but neighbors gathered on the street watching. News crews arrived. The quiet residential block was suddenly the center of a massive crime scene. As body after body was removed from the garden, neighbors stood in shock. Janet, who lived next door, said she felt like she was in a nightmare. She couldn't process what was happening. This was Dorothea, the sweet lady who baked cookies and grew beautiful flowers. This couldn't be real, but it was real. And there's an even more disturbing detail about how Dorothea was ultimately caught. During the initial police search, before they started digging in the yard, Dorothea asked if she could go inside to make them some coffee. The officers, not yet realizing the full extent of what they were dealing with, allowed her to do so. Dorothea walked into the house, walked straight through to the back, and fled. She just walked out the back door and left. Police didn't even realize she was gone for several minutes. By the time they figured it out, Dorothea was in the wind. Dorothea went on the run for several days. She took a bus to Los Angeles and checked into a cheap motel. She dyed her hair, changed her appearance. She might have stayed hidden longer, but she made a mistake. She went to a bar to have a drink and got into a conversation with an elderly man. She told him her name was Donna Johansson. They chatted, had a few drinks, and eventually the man, who'd been watching the news, recognized her. When Dorothea went to the bathroom, he called police. Officers arrived and arrested Dorothea at the bar. She didn't resist, didn't run. She just sighed and said, "I knew you'd find me eventually." The trial of Dorothea Puente was a media sensation. The grandmother serial killer who murdered her vulnerable tenants for their government checks. The defense tried to argue that the deaths were accidental, that the tenants died from natural causes or drug overdoses, and that Dorothea panicked and buried them, rather than reporting the deaths because she was afraid of being blamed. But the prosecution presented evidence of deliberate murder. Some victims had been drugged with lethal combinations of medications. Some showed signs of suffocation or poisoning. This wasn't panic. This was calculated homicide. Dorothea was convicted of 3 murders. There wasn't enough evidence to convict her of all 9, but everyone involved knew she was responsible for all of them. She was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. She died in prison in 2011 at the age of 82. Throughout her incarceration, she maintained her innocence, claiming she was a victim of circumstance, that she'd tried to help people and they'd died through no fault of hers. She painted herself as a martyr. Nobody believed her. The boarding house where Dorothea operated was torn down. The lot remained vacant for years because nobody wanted to build on land where so many people had been murdered and buried. The address became notorious. True crime enthusiasts would drive by to see where the death house had stood. For the people who actually lived there, who had known Dorothea, who had interacted with her regularly, the trauma was real and lasting. Janet, who lived next door and had been friends with Dorothea, said she had nightmares for years. She had stood at the fence, talking to Dorothea, had eaten cookies baked by Dorothea's hands that had killed 9 people. The fence they chatted over looked directly into the yard where bodies were buried. Janet said she couldn't garden anymore, couldn't dig in dirt without thinking about Dorothea's garden and what had been buried there. She moved away within a year of the discovery, selling her house at a loss just to get away from the memories. Harold, who had done repairs and walked over the graves, felt sick knowing he had walked over human remains. He said he couldn't get the image out of his head. The thought that he'd been standing on top of dead bodies while Dorothea smiled and chatted and served him lunch. He said every time he'd complimented her garden, every time he'd admired how well her flowers grew, he'd been complimenting a graveyard. The knowledge of what he'd been standing on, what he'd been looking at, it haunted him until his death several years later. The sweet grandmother figure who baked cookies and tended her garden was a serial killer who preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. She killed them in their sleep, buried them in her yard, and then collected their checks. And she did it all while maintaining this perfect facade of a kind elderly woman who was just trying to help people. That's what makes Dorothea Puente so disturbing. She used people's assumptions about what a grandmother should be like as cover for her crimes. She knew nobody would suspect a little old lady of being a predator. And she was right. She operated for years before anyone caught on. This case takes us to a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri, and involves a man named Maury Travis. In the early 2000s, Maury lived with his mother in a middle-class neighborhood. He was in his mid-30s, worked various jobs, kept a low profile. Neighbors who knew him said he was quiet, maybe a bit odd, but not threatening. He would help his mother with yard work. He'd wave hello if you saw him outside. Just another guy living in his childhood home, nothing remarkable. The neighborhood was quiet, tree-lined, the kind of place where people knew each other, casually, but mostly kept to themselves. But Maury had a secret. He was abducting women, taking them to his basement and torturing them. He had converted his basement into a torture chamber with soundproofing and restraints. He would videotape his torture sessions, filming himself torturing and murdering women. Between 2000 and 2002, Maury killed at least 12 women, though investigators believe the number may be higher. His victims were mostly sex workers or women struggling with addiction. They were women Maury thought wouldn't be missed, women whose disappearances wouldn't trigger massive investigations. Maury's neighbors had no idea what was happening in his basement. One neighbor, a woman named Linda who lived next door, said she would sometimes hear thumping sounds through the shared wall, like furniture being moved or someone exercising. She assumed Maury had a home gym or was rearranging his basement. The sounds would happen late at night sometimes, which Linda found mildly annoying, but not alarming. She'd bang on the wall if it got too loud, and the noise would stop. What Linda was actually hearing was Maury torturing women. The sounds that annoyed her, that disrupted her sleep, were the sounds of victims suffering just feet away from where she slept. Another neighbor, a retired man named George, who lived across the street, said he noticed Maury seemed to be home at odd hours. Maury's car would be gone at night and back by morning. George figured Maury worked a night shift somewhere, maybe at a warehouse or factory. George would see Maury's mother outside sometimes, tending to her garden, and they'd chat. She seemed like a sweet lady, very friendly, clearly cared about her son. George felt sorry for her, raising her adult son alone. He didn't know she was living with a serial killer, that the house she owned was being used as a torture chamber. The truth about Maury came out in 2002, when police investigating the disappearance of several women traced communications to Maury's address. Maury had been taunting police, sending them letters and maps showing where he dumped bodies. He was playing games, thinking he was smarter than the investigators. But he made mistakes, and those mistakes led police right to his door. When police came to arrest Maury on June 7th, 2002, his mother answered the door. She was cooperative, clearly confused about why police were there. She called Maury down from upstairs and stepped aside as officers arrested him. Maury didn't resist. He seemed almost relieved to be caught. Police searched the house with Maury's mother present, and what they found in the basement destroyed her. It was every mother's worst nightmare, discovering that your child, the person you raised and loved, was a monster. The basement had been completely soundproofed. Maury had installed special insulation and padding on the walls to muffle any sounds. There were restraints bolted to the walls and floor. There was a makeshift torture table, and there were videotapes. Dozens of videotapes showing Maury torturing and murdering women. The tapes were meticulously labeled with dates and what appeared to be the victims' names or nicknames. Maury had been documenting his crimes, creating a library of his atrocities. Police also found evidence that Maury had been running a website on the dark web where he shared videos and images of his crimes with other sadists. He was part of an online community of people who got pleasure from watching torture and murder. Some of the videos he shared were his own. Others he downloaded from other users. The digital forensics team found thousands of images and videos on Maury's computer, a collection of human suffering that took investigators months to process. The victims whose bodies were recovered showed signs of prolonged torture. They'd been held captive for hours or days before being killed. The cause of death varied. Some were strangled, some were beaten to death, some died from their injuries during torture. The level of cruelty was extreme, even by the standards of investigators who'd worked homicide for years. Maury had taken his time with his victims, had savored their suffering, had recorded it all to watch again later. Linda, the neighbor who'd heard thumping sounds, was horrified when she learned the truth. She was interviewed by police multiple times, asked about what she'd heard, when she'd heard it, how often. She said she felt like she was going to vomit during the interviews, realizing that every time she'd heard those sounds and banged on the wall to complain about noise, there had been a woman on the other side of that wall being tortured. She said she had nightmares about it, about lying in her bed, listening to thumping sounds while a woman died just feet away. She wondered if any of the women heard her banging on the wall, if they thought someone was going to help them, if they felt hope that was then crushed when no one came. Linda moved away within a year. She said every time she heard any noise through a wall, she panicked, thinking someone might be in trouble. She developed severe anxiety and needed therapy. She said the guilt was crushing, even though rationally she knew she couldn't have known what those sounds really were. But the rational part of her brain couldn't override the feeling that she should have investigated, should have called police, should have done something more than just bang on the wall and roll over and go back to sleep. George, the neighbor across the street, said the saddest part was Maury's mother. She was completely blindsided. Her son, who she'd raised and cared for, who still lived with her in his 30s, was a monster. The basement where Maury committed his crimes was in the house she owned, the house she'd lived in for decades. She felt responsible even though she'd had no idea. She said she wished she'd known, wished she'd seen signs, wished she could have stopped him. But the reality was, Maury had hidden his true nature from her completely. He'd been careful, secretive, manipulative. Maury's mother had to deal with not just the horror of what her son had done, but also the practical and legal consequences. The victims' families filed wrongful death lawsuits against her, claiming she should have known what was happening in her house. While these lawsuits were ultimately dismissed as she genuinely had no knowledge of the crimes, the process was devastating for her. She was forced to relive the horror over and over, to defend herself in court, to hear in detail what her son had done in her home. George said Maury's mother sold the house and moved away immediately after Maury's arrest, but she was destroyed by what happened. Her whole life, her identity as a mother, was shattered by learning what her son had done. George said he saw her a few months after everything happened, ran into her at a grocery store in a different part of town. He said she looked like she'd aged 20 years. She was hollow, broken. They didn't speak. She saw him, recognized him, and quickly left. George understood. He was a reminder of the neighborhood, of the life she'd had before discovering the truth about her son. Maury Travis never went to trial. He hanged himself in his jail cell on June 10th, 2002, just 3 days after his arrest. He left behind videotapes showing the torture and murder of multiple women, evidence that continues to haunt investigators who had to watch them. One detective who worked the case said the videos were the worst thing he'd ever seen in his career, worse than any crime scene, because you could see the fear in the victims' eyes, could hear them begging for their lives, could watch Maury enjoying their suffering. The detective said he needed therapy after working the Travis case, that he couldn't get the images out of his head. The house where Maury lived with his mother was sold. The basement was completely gutted and renovated, with the torture chamber destroyed and rebuilt as a normal basement. But people in the neighborhood know. They know what happened there. They know women died there while neighbors went about their normal lives just feet away. The house sold for well below market value, and it took years to find a buyer. Even then, there was controversy about whether the realtor properly disclosed the property's history. The new owners were told, but they decided to buy anyway, viewing it as an opportunity to get a house they otherwise couldn't afford. They say they've cleansed the space, blessed it, and don't feel any negative energy. But neighbors still give that house uneasy glances when they walk by. The videotapes that Maury made, the ones showing his crimes, presented a unique challenge for investigators and prosecutors. They were crucial evidence, but they were also deeply disturbing and potentially dangerous. There was concern that if the tapes were ever leaked or released, they could inspire copycat crimes or provide gratification to other sadists. The decision was made to keep the tapes sealed, with only select investigators and prosecutors allowed to view them. They've never been released to the public, and the families of the victims have been spared having to watch them. But the existence of those tapes means that Maury's crimes are documented in a way that most serial killer crimes aren't. Usually, investigators have to piece together what happened based on physical evidence, confessions, witness testimony. With Maury, they had video documentation of his murders. This made the investigation both easier and more traumatic. Easier because the evidence was irrefutable. More traumatic because investigators had to watch the crimes happen, had to see the victims' final moments, had to witness evil in real time. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Maury Travis case is how he selected his victims. He would cruise areas known for prostitution, looking for women who seemed the most vulnerable, women who were clearly struggling with addiction, who looked desperate, who seemed like they had no support system. He would approach them, offer money for sex, and they would get in his car. He would then drive them to his house, telling them they were going somewhere private. Once inside, he would overpower them and take them to the basement. The victims never had a chance. They thought they were doing a job, earning money to survive, and instead they walked into a nightmare. The families of Maury's victims have spoken publicly about the difficulty of getting justice when your loved one is a sex worker or drug addict. They said police didn't take the disappearances seriously at first. When they reported their daughters or sisters missing, they were told that sex workers and addicts disappear all the time, that they probably just moved to a different city or didn't want to be found. The families felt dismissed, felt like their loved ones' lives didn't matter because of the struggles they faced. This allowed Maury to continue killing without serious scrutiny until he made mistakes that led police to him. One victim's mother said in an interview that she'd been reporting her daughter missing for months before police finally investigated seriously. She said she knew something was wrong, that her daughter called her regularly, and suddenly the calls stopped. But police told her that drug addicts are unpredictable, that her daughter was probably fine and would turn up when she was ready. The mother tried to investigate herself, asking around in the areas where her daughter worked, showing people photos. She was told by police to stop interfering, that they would handle it. But they weren't handling it. And her daughter's torture and murder was being videotaped in Maury Travis' basement, while police told her mother to be patient. The Maury Travis case led to some changes in how police handle missing persons cases involving sex workers and drug addicts. There's more awareness now that these are vulnerable populations who are specifically targeted by predators precisely because society devalues them and doesn't take their disappearances seriously. But advocates say there's still a long way to go. Sex workers still disappear at alarming rates. Their cases still don't get the same resources as cases involving more sympathetic victims. The systemic issues that allowed Maury to kill 12 women without serious investigation until he practically turned himself in, those issues still exist. The neighbors on Maury Street, the people who lived near him during his killing spree, they struggle with the knowledge of what was happening so close to them. Linda, who heard the sounds through the wall, moved away but carries the guilt with her. George, who thought Maury's mother was a sweet lady, still thinks about her sometimes, wonders how she's doing, feels sad for what she lost. Other neighbors, people who never spoke to Maury but saw him around, they wonder if they could have noticed something, if there was some sign they missed. The reality is that Maury was careful. He soundproofed his basement specifically to prevent neighbors from hearing what was happening. He abducted his victims from areas far from his home so there was no connection. He disposed of bodies in various locations to avoid establishing a pattern. He cleaned meticulously to avoid leaving evidence in his car or home. He was organized, methodical, and patient. These traits made him an effective killer and made it nearly impossible for neighbors to realize what was happening. But the soundproofing wasn't perfect, which is why Linda heard thumping sounds. This raises the haunting question of how many of Maury's victims might have heard her banging on the wall in return. Did they think someone was coming to help? Did they scream louder, hoping the neighbor would call police? Did they feel hope in their final moments, only to have that hope extinguished when no rescue came? These are questions Linda tortures herself with, questions that have no answers, but that haunt her nonetheless. The online component of Maury's crimes added another disturbing dimension. He wasn't just killing for his own gratification. He was sharing his crimes with an audience, getting validation and encouragement from other sadists. This community of people who traded videos and images of torture and murder, they enabled each other, normalized their depravity. Maury felt less alone in his sickness because he found others like him online. This made him more confident, more prolific. The internet, which connects people in positive ways, also connects monsters and makes them more dangerous. Law enforcement's investigation into Maury's online activities led them to other predators in the network. Some were arrested and charged with their own crimes. Others were identified and are now under surveillance. The dark web communities where this content is shared are constantly monitored by specialized task forces. But it's a game of whack-a-mole. Sites get shut down and new ones pop up. Users get arrested and new users join. The problem persists because the demand exists. There are people who want to watch women being tortured and murdered. And where there's demand, someone will supply. Maury Travis's suicide in jail robbed his victims' families of justice. There was no trial, no opportunity for them to confront him, no chance for him to be held publicly accountable. He took the easy way out, escaping the consequences of his actions. His death was seen by many as cowardly, a final act of selfishness from a man who'd caused immeasurable suffering. But his suicide also meant that certain questions would never be answered. How many women did he really kill? Were there other burial sites? Were there other accomplices? Maury took these secrets to his grave. The house where Maury lived, where he committed his crimes, it stands as a reminder of how evil can exist in ordinary spaces. From the outside, It looks like every other house on the street. There's nothing about it that suggests horror. The new owners have made it their home, have filled it with normal family life. But the history remains, embedded in the structure itself. The basement where women died has been renovated, but the space is the same. The walls that were soundproof to muffle screams still stand. The house remembers, even if the current residents prefer to forget. This brings us to the end of our series on Nightmare Neighbors. 5 cases across 3 videos. Dennis Rader, Fred and Rose West, Anthony Sowell, Dorothea Puente, and Maury Travis. Each one a monster who hid in plain sight, who lived among normal people, who committed unspeakable crimes while neighbors went about their daily lives just feet away. These cases show us that evil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like we expect it to look. It can seem normal, boring, forgettable. It can live next door, and we might never know until it's too late. The neighbors in these cases, the people who lived beside these killers, they carry trauma that will never fully heal. They question their judgment, their instincts, their awareness. They feel guilt even though rationally they know they couldn't have known. They struggle with trust, with feeling safe in their own homes and neighborhoods. Some have moved away, trying to escape the memories. Others stayed, but were forever changed. All of them had their fundamental understanding of reality shaken. They thought they knew what danger looked like. They were wrong. For those of us hearing these stories, the takeaway isn't paranoia. We can't live in constant fear of our neighbors, suspicious of everyone around us. That's not a healthy or sustainable way to exist. But we can be aware. We can pay attention. We can trust our instincts when something feels off. We can be more connected with our communities, looking out for vulnerable people who might be targeted. We can push for systemic changes that ensure all missing persons cases are taken seriously, regardless of the victim's background. We can support survivors and families of victims, believing them when they say something is wrong. These 5 cases represent just a fraction of the instances where neighbors turned out to be hiding horrific secrets. There are many more stories like these, cases where ordinary appearing people committed extraordinary evil while living in ordinary neighborhoods. The common thread is that the monsters relied on our tendency to assume the best of people, to accept surface explanations, to mind our own business. They counted on our natural inclination toward trust and community, and they exploited it ruthlessly. But there's also hope in these stories. Every one of these killers was eventually caught. Justice, however delayed, eventually came. The neighbors who noticed things and reported them, even when they weren't taken seriously at first, they were doing the right thing. The investigators who didn't give up, who followed every lead, who believed the victims and their families, they made the difference. The systems that failed can be improved. The oversights that allowed these killers to operate can be addressed. We can learn from these tragedies and work to prevent future ones. Thank you for watching this entire series. I know it was heavy, disturbing content. These aren't easy stories to hear or to tell. But they're important. They remind us of the darkness that can exist, and they honor the victims by ensuring they're not forgotten. Before we finish, I want to spend some time reflecting on what these 5 cases tell us about human nature, about evil, and about the communities we live in. Because while these stories are about specific individuals and specific crimes, they also reveal broader truths about how we interact with each other and how predators exploit the social contracts that hold neighborhoods together. One of the most striking patterns across all 5 cases is how the killers weaponized normalcy. They understood what society expected from a good neighbor, a responsible citizen, a caring family member, and they performed those roles perfectly while committing atrocities. Dennis Rader was the ultimate rules follower, the guy who enforced city codes and led church groups. Fred West was the working-class guy doing home repairs. Anthony Sowell kept to himself in a neighborhood where privacy was valued. Dorothea Puente was the sweet grandmother baking cookies. Maury Travis was the quiet guy who helped his mom with yard work. None of them fit our mental image of what a monster looks like. This is a crucial point that often gets lost in true crime discussions. We want to believe that evil is obvious, that dangerous people wear signs announcing their intentions. We want to think we'd recognize a predator if we met one. But the reality is that the most successful predators are the ones who look least like predators. They're good at mimicking normal human behavior and emotions. They understand social cues and know how to make people feel comfortable around them. This isn't an accident. It's a survival skill for them. If they seemed obviously dangerous, they'd be caught immediately. So they learn to blend in, to seem harmless, to be forgettable. The neighbors in these cases didn't fail to notice warning signs. In most cases, there weren't clear warning signs to notice. Or the signs that did exist were so subtle, so easily explained by innocent causes, that flagging them would have seemed paranoid. When Sharon found Dennis Rader annoying for measuring her grass, what was she supposed to do with that feeling? Report him to police for being overly concerned with neighborhood aesthetics. When Margaret found Fred West vaguely creepy, but couldn't articulate why, should she have warned her daughter never to visit his house? Based on what? A feeling. This is the impossible position that these neighbors were in. They had vague unease, subtle gut reactions, minor oddities they observed. But translating those observations into concrete action is difficult. We're socialized not to be too nosy, not to jump to conclusions, not to accuse people without evidence. These are generally good social norms. They prevent witch hunts and false accusations. But they also create cover for actual predators who understand how to exploit our reluctance to interfere or make accusations. The sounds that neighbors heard are particularly haunting across these cases. Linda heard thumping through her shared wall with Maury Travis. Harold heard scraping and digging through his shared wall with Fred West. Anthony Sowell's neighbors complained about terrible smells for years. In each case, the neighbors noticed something and even acted on it to some degree. Linda banged on the wall. Harold banged on the wall. Sowell's neighbors reported the smell to the city. But none of them took the next step of calling police or demanding investigation, because the explanations seemed plausible. Exercise equipment, home repairs, a nearby factory. Why would you immediately jump to torture chamber, grave digging, or decomposing bodies? The hindsight bias is strong when we hear these stories. We know what was really happening, so the signs seem obvious in retrospect. Of course those sounds were suspicious. Of course that smell was human remains. Of course that creepy vibe meant actual danger. But in the moment, without the benefit of knowing the outcome, these things were ambiguous. Our brains are wired to find patterns and make sense of things. And they did exactly that. They found the most likely, most reasonable explanation for what was observed. The fact that the reasonable explanation was wrong doesn't mean the neighbors failed. It means the killers succeeded at their deception. Let's talk specifically about the smell factor, because it comes up in multiple cases. Anthony Sowell's neighbors complained about terrible odors for years. The city investigated and blamed a nearby sausage factory. Dorothea Puente's neighbors noticed odd smells from her property, but attributed it to gardening or compost. These weren't foolish conclusions. Many things smell bad that aren't corpses. Rotting garbage, dead animals, sewage problems, compost, nearby industrial sites. All of these are far more common than human decomposition. So when neighbors smelled something unpleasant, of course they assumed it was one of these normal causes. The failure in these cases wasn't with the neighbors who reported the smells. It was with the officials who investigated and accepted the first plausible explanation without thorough follow-through. In Anthony Sowell's case, city inspectors came out multiple times, but never insisted on entering Sowell's property to check if the smell was coming from there. They blamed the factory and moved on. If they had been more thorough, if they had demanded access to Sowell's property, they would have found the bodies. Multiple women would still be alive. This was a systemic failure, not a neighbor failure. Similarly, in cases where neighbors called police about suspicious activity or reported people missing, the police response was often inadequate. Glenda Cleveland, who lived in Jeffrey Dahmer's building, called police multiple times about the 14-year-old boy Dahmer claimed was his boyfriend. She insisted something was wrong. Police dismissed her concerns and returned the boy to Dahmer, where he was murdered. This isn't mentioned in our 5 cases, but it's relevant context. When neighbors do notice things and report them, they're relying on police to investigate properly. When police fail to do so, as they did in the Dahmer case, in the Sowell case, and in others, the neighbors' efforts are wasted. The victims' families in these cases carry their own unique trauma. They lost their loved ones to horrific violence. They had to wait years for justice in many cases. They had to hear defense attorneys try to blame the victims for their own deaths. They had to sit through trials listening to graphic descriptions of what happened. And in many cases, they had to fight to have their loved ones' cases taken seriously in the first place. The families of Anthony Sowell's victims, the families of Maury Travis's victims, they were told their daughters and sisters probably just moved on, that they'd turn up eventually. The systemic devaluation of certain lives, particularly sex workers and drug addicts, allowed these killers to operate longer than they otherwise could have. This is an uncomfortable truth that we need to confront. Serial killers who target marginalized people get away with it longer than those who target more sympathetic victims. Anthony Sowell killed black women struggling with addiction. Maury Travis killed sex workers. These women's disappearances weren't prioritized. Their families' concerns weren't taken seriously. This isn't an accident. It's a reflection of who society values and who society considers disposable. Until we address these underlying prejudices, predators will continue to exploit them. The children in these cases, both the killer's children and the children who lived in these neighborhoods, carry lasting trauma. Dennis Rader's daughter talks about the impossibility of reconciling her memories of her father with the knowledge of what he did. How do you make sense of birthday parties and softball games when you know your dad murdered children? The West children, some of whom were abused by Fred and Rose, have struggled with addiction, mental illness, and the stigma of being serial killers' children. The children who visited these houses, who played with these killers' children, who had no idea what evil they were close to, many of them needed therapy to process the experience. There's also the question of how these killers chose their homes and neighborhoods. Was it strategic or coincidental? Dennis Rader chose a middle-class neighborhood that fit his image as a respectable family man. Fred and Rose West lived in a working-class area where rough edges were common and people minded their own business. Anthony Sowell lived in a neighborhood where prostitution and drug activity were common, making his victim's presence less noticeable. Dorothea Puente's boarding house was in Sowell's area where vulnerable people congregated, giving her access to potential victims. Maury Travis lived with his mother in a quiet neighborhood that gave no one reason to suspect him. In each case, the location either supported their cover or provided access to victims or both. The speed at which these neighborhoods changed after the crimes were revealed is striking. Property values collapsed. Residents moved away. The sense of community evaporated. These were neighborhoods where people had lived for years or decades, where they'd raised families and built lives. And overnight, that was destroyed. The stigma of being the street where BTK lived, or the neighborhood where the death house stood, it's not something that fades quickly. Even decades later, these locations are known for the crimes that occurred there. Some neighborhoods tried to rebrand, to distance themselves from the crimes. Street signs were changed or removed to deter souvenir hunters. Houses were demolished to erase physical reminders. New construction tried to transform the spaces. But the history can't be erased. Locals remember. True crime enthusiasts research and visit. The internet preserves every detail. The neighborhoods are permanently marked by what happened there. The question of whether these crimes could have been prevented haunts everyone involved. Could Sharon have stopped Dennis Rader if she'd reported him for being too strict about rules? Could Harold have saved someone if he'd called police about the digging sounds instead of just banging on the wall? Could Anthony Sowell's victims have been rescued if city officials had investigated the smell more thoroughly? The answer is maybe, but probably not. These weren't failures of individual neighbors. These were systemic failures, combined with incredibly skillful predators. The 5 killers we've discussed weren't impulsive or sloppy. They were organized, patient, and careful. They planned their crimes. They covered their tracks. They maintained their facades for years or decades. They understood human psychology and social dynamics well enough to exploit them. This doesn't make them geniuses. It makes them practiced predators who'd learned what worked. And what worked was looking normal, acting normal, being the person people expected them to be. The videotapes that Maury Travis made of his crimes. The souvenirs that Dennis Rader kept from his victims. The detailed documentation that these killers maintained. It speaks to another disturbing aspect of their psychology. They weren't just killing. They were collecting experiences, creating libraries of their atrocities to revisit. This suggests a level of detachment and objectification of their victims that's chilling. The victims weren't people to them. They were objects, toys, sources of entertainment. This complete absence of empathy, this ability to inflict suffering without remorse, it's what makes them monsters. But they weren't monsters all the time. That's what the neighbors testify to. Dennis Rader coached his daughter's softball team with genuine enthusiasm. Dorothea Puente baked cookies that were genuinely delicious. Maury Travis genuinely helped his mother with yard work. These weren't entirely acts. Some part of them was capable of normal human behavior and relationships. They compartmentalized. They could be fathers, neighbors, sons, and killers simultaneously. This compartmentalization is difficult for normal people to understand. How do you murder someone and then go home and tuck your kids into bed? How do you torture women in your basement and then help your elderly mother with her garden? The psychological mechanisms that allow this are foreign to most of us, which is why we struggle to recognize it in others. The legacy of these 5 cases extends beyond the immediate victims and neighborhoods. They've become part of true crime culture, studied by investigators, analyzed by psychologists, featured in documentaries and books. They've influenced police procedures and investigative techniques. They've changed how missing persons cases are handled, at least in theory, if not always in practice. They've made people more aware of the warning signs of predatory behavior, even though those signs are subtle and easily misinterpreted. They've shown us that evil is real, that it can live next door, and that vigilance without paranoia is necessary. For those of us consuming these stories as entertainment or education, there's a responsibility to remember the victims as people, not just as plot points in a horrifying narrative. These were real women with families who loved them. They had hopes and dreams and struggles. They didn't deserve what happened to them, and their families didn't deserve to lose them this way. When we watch true crime content, we should honor the victims by not just focusing on the sensational details of the crimes, but by remembering the human cost and advocating for changes that might prevent future tragedies. The neighbors in these stories, the innocent people who lived beside monsters, they deserve compassion too. They carry guilt and trauma that isn't their fault. They made decisions with incomplete information that seemed reasonable at the time. They trusted their communities, and that trust was betrayed. They're victims too, in a different way. Not victims of the crimes themselves, but victims of the aftermath, of the knowledge, of the violation of everything they thought they knew about their lives and neighborhoods. Their stories remind us that the impact of these crimes ripples far beyond the direct victims.